2 weeks ago, I took an emotional trip back 50 years when I visited and preached at my former congregation, Augsburg Lutheran Church. It was definitely a trip back into memory lane to an appointed time which had great influence upon my life. Prior to this time, I had been an assistant pastor in 2 congregations, during which I was mainly in charge of the educational and youth programs. But now with Augsburg, I was pastor for everybody and everything. At that time, believe it or not, the congregation had a membership of around 150 people and was considered to be a very small congregation. Times have really changed. Augsburg at that time was rather unique. Unique in the Lutheran Church, for it was almost all Afro-American, with only 4 white members besides my wife and myself. It was and is located in 95% African American community in the northwest section of Baltimore, and was economically mixed with a large middle class. By the way, we lived next door in what was really a beautiful parsonage. That's just a personal note. In going back that Sunday 2 weeks ago, I could recall almost all the members in my mind with a special memory associated with each of them. But equally in my mind and my recollection were the events and experiences which happened during those eventful years in the late 60s and early 70s. Almost like today, it was a tumultuous and very tumultuous time within our nation. Some have called them the rebellious years. It was a time which the anti-war movement of mainly young people holding sit-ins and demonstrations on college campuses, as well as in the streets of our cities. At the same time, the civil rights movement gained widespread involvement under the leadership of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. It was during these years that the frustration within both the movements were at a boiling point. Although there was support for the Vietnam protesters within the African American community, what really found traction was the civil rights movement, since the community had experienced generations of prejudice and inequality. To know the people in my congregation and in the community, and to see and hear their stories affected me very deeply. For I was experiencing the pain of prejudice firsthand. I realized in life's terms, Maya Angelou's words, quote, "Prejudice is a burden that confuses the past, threatens the future, and renders the present inaccessible." 50 years ago, this tumultuous time culminated in the assassination of Dr. King, in which the deep-seated frustration boiled over into the riots, which began to awaken the country to the injustices which continue to linger on. As I began preaching from that same pulpit 2 Sundays ago, I stood in the from the pulpit in which I stood during these tumultuous times, I realized that although there have been changes during these 50 years since then, prejudice, inequality, and injustice still are deeply entrenched in our society and are affecting all of us right now. In that regards, during these 50 years, not much has changed. We are again in a tumultuous time, living with the results of deep-seated prejudice. Standing in that same pulpit and looking at the faces of the people I knew and loved, and seeing in my mind the faces which have departed, standing there that Sunday, I realized one of the greatest gifts which they gave me. That was the lesson of being hopeful. When you think about how the African American community has had to live and survive a life which in reality may seem filled with hopelessness, but yet they kept living in hope that things would change, as captured in their rally song, "We Shall Overcome." They are a living example, no matter what we face. They are a living example that hope is still alive. Even though we live in a nation deeply embedded in prejudice, injustice, and inequality, that Sunday I realized that having faith in a living hope has the ability to bring about changes, no matter how small or great they may be. I realize that hope is not dead. This brings us to our gospel lesson, which demonstrates this. As we discussed last week, Jesus had just turned the Jewish society upside down by denouncing the core of their legalistic religion. So revolutionary were his statements that he fled north into the land of the Gentiles, the Syrian territory of Tyre, in order to escape the wrath. It was in this foreign land that Jesus would again break the laws and traditions of the Jews. This time, he broke the Jewish laws concerning talking with a Gentile, a non-Jew, a Syrophoenician woman. To have such an association with an unclean Gentile was forbidden. In actuality, in doing so, he was breaking down the barriers of prejudice and hatred, for this event points directly to the extreme prejudice of that day. It turns out to be somewhat of a tongue-in-cheek event, an even battle of wits and conversations with this woman. Both Jesus and the woman clearly understand it had to be that way. She had sought Jesus to heal her daughter from a demon, most likely a mental disorder. Jesus first responded to her request in the most orthodox Jewish way. Although a good Jew would not even recognize the woman, no less respond to her. The breaking of this precedent by answering her signaled that what followed was tongue-in-cheek or even cynical. He said, to her request. Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. In other words, such acts of God are only for his chosen people of Israel and not for the unclean Gentiles. What's the matter with you? Can't you understand that that is the way, woman? Be satisfied with your lot in life. Now, the woman, seeing Jesus' statement for what it was, replied in kind, Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Now, this woman was very sharp and would not be denied, for she turned Jesus' usage of the dogs of the street to the cherished household dogs. In other words, there is even more leftover food to feed those beyond the house of Israel. She understood that Jesus' message of God's love has no limitations. She knew this. With this response, Jesus knew the depth of this woman's faith, which went well beyond any prejudices. So he responded, for saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. Now, with this incident, Jesus again turned the Jewish world upside down. He shattered the long-standing prejudice and hatred between Jew and Gentile. This brief encounter declared that God was Father of all people, Jew and Gentile alike, all races, all nationalities, and all stations in life. In God's love, there is no room for prejudice or hate. He created everybody, and therefore there is no distinction as to who can receive his love and forgiveness. His grace is for all who seek it. It is a message which reaches out with love and forgiveness, not with any prejudice, revenge, or hatred. Now, does this mean that we should let people get by with indiscriminate acts of murder and destruction? And I don't think so. But we must be extremely careful not to react blindly in an indiscriminate way. This may just be no better than the original perpetrators, for innocent lives may be at stake, and we become the perpetrators of acts of prejudice and hatred. And this is not the gospel of Jesus. It is not why God sent his Son to us. He was sent to break through these human pitfalls which create pain and suffering. This is why he showed us his overwhelming love through the cross, and is why he clearly told us what he must do to inherit this abundant love for ourselves. Remember these words. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, as we remember 9/11 this week, it will be so easy to remember the tragedy of pain, suffering, and death, as well as the prejudice and hatred, which was the motivation behind the terrors. And the motivation of so many who showed hatred after 9/11. But let us never be diverted from those who selflessly gave their lives in order to help save the lives of others. There was no prejudice there whatsoever. They gave their lives for whoever needed to be saved. That is the goodness and love which lies within each of us, which must continually shine forth from our personal and collective lives as a society and nation. It is goodness and love which will help us through these troubling times in which prejudice and hatred and revenge is so prevalent. Unless we as individuals examine who we are and how we respond to and live with others in the light of God's love, the world around us will continue to polarize and continue to create and even promote human suffering. There is no room for prejudice in God's love. Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman point us to the right, in the right direction, for we are all God's children who experience the basic desires in life to be treated equally as a child of God. Therein is the hope which we must live in order to make a difference. Hope is alive and can be within each of us. And we are the ones who will make the difference. Amen.